Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Glen Edwards, who is an Australian national security consultant located in Canberra. He specializes in information warfare and information power and has a particular interest in integrating military information activities with national efforts. Glen Edwards, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you very much, John. Happy to be here.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Glen, will cover your thought leadership on information warfare and the framework that you have developed. But before we get into these topics, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape?
Yeah, sure. I'll probably comment more from an Australian-centric perspective, which is pretty focused on the Indo-Pacific, but we're certainly learning an incredible amount from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But essentially, there's a strong view in Australia right now that our geostrategic circumstances are deteriorating. The rules-based international order, something that Australia has benefited greatly from, appears to be weakening and is being challenged by authoritarian states. Russia's actions in Ukraine have been a particular interest. They've shown a willingness to resort to violence and coercion, but then Ukraine's actions have shown that it's not necessarily easy for authoritarian states to have their way. The other consideration for Australia is the belief that we need to be able to pull our own weight and operate in a contested environment with sovereign capabilities. It's not that we have concerns over our allies, particularly the US are important contributors to our security. But the tyranny of distance means we're going to have to be pretty self-reliant. Again, Ukraine has been instructive here in terms of the importance of that resilience, of a whole of nation approach. And if it gets to it, survival and massed long-range fires. So the Australian system right now is thinking really deeply about how to navigate this geostrategic environment, these challenges. War and violence is not the future that Australia wants. So we're really driving changes about how we think about national power, how we work in our region as a force for good, work with partners and allies, thinking about the capabilities we acquire and sustain, and how we can actually build asymmetric advantage, because Australia is not going to be the biggest country in the room. We're not going to have the biggest military. And therefore, it's really meant information power, information warfare are something that's coming to the fore in Australian strategic thinking. It's somewhere we can have a sustainable and survivable advantage. And I think most importantly, it's an area where we can be proactive in the region and have that positive effect.
Yeah, it's great hearing your perspective on all that, Glen. I gave a very brief introduction at the top of this, but it doesn't do your background justice. You've had an extensive career. Could you just give a little bit more background on what you've done to date?
Yeah, sure. I've had a pretty diverse background in national security, and funnily enough, it started as a part-time combat engineering officer within the Australian Army, and that was really just a means for me to stay out of trouble at uni, pay for all the various costs of uni, and I enjoyed that for a number of years, and I think that really taught me some of those kind of basic skills about what is national security and how to operate in a defense environment, but eventually I decided to get serious about my career and move to Canberra, the capital, to join the federal government as a member of the national security community. Over this time, I experienced quite a few agencies, organizations, whether it be as postings in my uniform capacity or as a civilian member. And it's covered areas such as counterterrorism, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear threats, information operations, and a bit of counterintelligence. What it meant, though, is I think I started to get a pretty good understanding of how national security, how defense, how these various areas, what they do have in common and where they are different. And it's kind of led me to where I am now in terms of really thinking about the foundations of things like intelligence, information warfare? What are the theories that actually underpin it?
Right. Well, maybe we can step into that just a little bit. You've done a significant amount of thinking and writing about information warfare, and you've developed a really interesting framework as well. Do you think you could start unpacking that a little bit for us?
Yeah, you bet. You bet. So I kind of fell into theory work. I still think of myself as a practitioner first, but I found myself frustrated with what seemed to be a lack of unified identity and foundation in the information space. And this really jarred with my experience, particularly in Army and in combat engineering, where you go through this process of learning about land warfare, and you go through this process of learning about the land domain, and then you specialize into your, for me, for engineering. And it meant that wherever you went in the Army, you could see where you were in relation to everyone else. And I just didn't necessarily see that when it came to intelligence versus information versus signals and comms and all that kind of thing. So the theory work I've been doing really tries to find a geometry that information warfighters can see themselves within. I was fortunate that I was providing consulting services to defense and was in a position to talk to a lot of practitioners, a lot of, I guess, clients or users of information, and a lot of information related capabilities. And a special shout out here to Major General Susan Coyle and her team in the Information Warfare Division. They are really grappling this with this at the joint level. And of course,
previous podcast guest too.
Yeah, and I've listened to it too. Really big issues. And then, of course, Dr. Patrick Blannon in the Defence Science Technology Group, DSTG, part of Defence. He, being a doctor level, is able to take, the things I say and actually make sure that they are intelligent and that they do make sense. And so he's been able to really help this theory work become something a bit more academically rigorous. But really, for me, it was the basic question of what is information. In militaries, we don't always think deeply about that. I've often heard information as data in context, and we like to silo information versus data versus intelligence. We stovepipe ourselves, and then kind of can't see that geometry and can't see ourselves between in that broader environment. Fortunately, information science saves the day. Theoretical physicists in particular have really thought about what is information and how does it relate to our universe. And their conclusion is that it's pretty much foundational to everything. Everything has an informational element. The biggest eureka moment for me was realizing the need for a hand-in-glove relationship between intelligence and other information activities. I was lucky enough to talk to the Defense School of Intelligence recently, and they were quite receptive to this. But I think traditionally we've always seen intelligence as something that sits apart from somewhere else and it has to be separate from everything. But intelligence occurs in the information environment, whether you're assessing on a desk or you're collecting out in the field. You are influencing the information environment, whether you intend to or not. So the theory work is really trying to link all of this with, a good friend, Carl von Clausewitz. Is Clausewitz something that's done things like the Marine Corps and whatnot?
Yeah, we've talked about Clausewitz a good bit. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. You can't become an officer without hearing about Clausewitz, but he really looked at the nature of war as politics via violent and forceful means, and so my theory work has been trying to marry that and ensure that that information warfare does have that link to politics via other means, even though it might not be traditionally violent as we'd expect it, but it still has that influence and that ability to coerce.
Right. I really like that notion that information is everything, or you're constantly influencing whether you realize it or not, and that gets also to the Clausewitz comment about war is a continuum, or war is a continuation of politics by other means. It's like developing this competition mindset where everything blends and there are no silos like you were describing, and it's a real mindset shift for I don't know whether it's a quote unquote problem of the West, or it's a problem of people in general, and that we tend to think of things linearly, or chunking up activities. I've got my morning routine, I've got lunch, and then I've got my afternoon routine, and so I mean that right there is kind of siloing things as well. But we grappling with this information problem, and it sounds like your theory or your framework is trying to obliterate that siloing and looking at it more as a something that doesn't have a beginning, middle, or end. Is that going in the right direction at all?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, it'll be an eternal challenge, no matter what you look at. Eternal challenge between abstraction and simplification versus incredible detail and really trying to enumerate things to the great level. And you'll never have a sort of perfect balance, I think. But I guess what I've been trying to do in the theory work is, particularly frameworks, have something that can abstract very easily. And I always talk about assuring and advising and affecting into the information environment. And I can sort of talk more about that in a second. But those kind of three top level functions, as you go through the framework, start to unpack and go through things like core tasks. So what does it take to assure versus advise versus affect, and impact in terms of processes and kind of all these other elements that can drive the detailed practitioner work, and that's kind of that detail level, or exist at that really abstract level. So if you talk to a generalist or a senior decision maker, you can have it make sense to them, basically.
Yeah, great, Glenn. You shared with me some documents before we got started here, and we'll make the resources that Glenn is able to make available to our audience in the show notes. But I wanted to circle back. You mentioned the role of information as it has an advise, affect, and assure role. Could you unpack that just a little bit more for us?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, don't be. Some of the practitioners might get quite caught up in the words, so don't worry too much about the exact dictionary definition of these.
Right.
Yeah,
We had another guest on the podcast a while back, General John Davis, and
yeah,
he calls this dynamic term warfare. So
yeah,
we will try not to get too wrapped up around terms. Absolutely.
yeah. The definitional warfare is strong within the information space, and there are sometimes good reasons for it. But I think there are times when you need to be as exact as mission verbs, and that's in the operational space. And there are times where it's actually best, I think, to be a little bit fuzzy about your terms, because it allows you to break open stovepipes and think across capabilities and concepts. And so with assure, advise, affect, well, partly I just wanted three words that started with A, because then you could remember as the three A's, and it just came a little bit catchy. But really, it's about saying, hey, there are these kind of three eternal functions that information warfare or operations in the information environment are always going to be doing and generating and thinking about. The first function, the assure function, is really about making sure that you can actually maneuver in the information environment, that you have the infrastructure, the networks, the connections, whether it be digital or human to human or anything in between, to actually be able to move information, move data, and actually be ready to do the things that you want to do. And that really arises from the fact that the information environment's dynamic. It can be uncertain. We have things like entropy arising where things go from order to disorder. So you need this continual assurance function that makes sure that you have the certainty and the infrastructure you need to maneuver. And then we move to the advise function. Now, the advise function, a lot of it is kind of the intelligence that we know and love, but there's more to it in terms of generating the informational power, generating information as a resource, so that you can actually put it through that infrastructure and put it through the information system that you've built under the assure function. Now, this includes things like targeting advice, operational analysis, in addition to things like HUMINT, ISR, all the kinds of capabilities that we know and love. And then finally, it's the actual effect piece. And this is using information to generate specific effects within the information environment. And so this is things like your non-kinetic effects, your I guess what you traditionally call information operations or PSYOPs and those kinds of things. But it can be something as simple as what we saw in Ukraine with the US intelligence community releasing a bunch of intelligence to the global information environment. They presumably had in mind the following effects: preventing Russia from invading, or at least delaying it, allowing other actors to realize that there was a threat there and that further preparation was needed, and potentially just make things more confusing for Vladimir Putin. And so for me, this is an exact example of the power of a sure advise effect, is that these three functions are interdependent. So the US intelligence community could be considered an advise capability, but they conducted an effect task there. And then when you look at things like counterintelligence and who protects things like TS networks, you can also realize that a lot of the intelligence capabilities are actually also assure functions. And so there's this constant interplay of assuring, advising, and affecting in the information environment. And you're probably not going to have the resources to be able to do everything all at once. And in fact, sometimes when you affect in the battle space in particular, you might prevent your ability to advise. You might prevent some kind of collection that allows you to understand something, or vice versa. So there's this really interesting interplay across the three functions.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Great example too. Mentioning the recent Russo-Ukrainian war and releasing that information early. As you were describing the interplay there, you mentioned entropy, and I wanted to connect up entropy with one of your previous comments about information, like literally being everything, or words to that effect. And entropy is just a really interesting concept that I'm not sure how widely understood it is within the information professionals community, but I think it's one of those foundational uh, uh, information facts about the world that the information professionals community should know more about. And you've got a really cool reference to a philosopher. Her name is, correct me here, Taddeo. Is that right?
Yeah, today, Ms. Taddeo, and I do apologize because I cannot pronounce her first name, but I'm sure we can make sure we provide a link to her writings.
Right, but yeah, she talks about entropy and how entropy should be um, maintained within the information environment as much as possible, so that signals are true representations of the original phenomenon, and so that signals don't deteriorate, and so that decision makers can make better decisions based upon truer information. Do you think you could add just a little bit
Yeah,
more color to my clumsy description there?
no, sure. I mean, it's such a big topic, but you're quite right. It's super important. And my apologies to any physicists in the audience who know
Right.
better than I
Yeah,
do. But
for
I
sure.
think
Yeah.
entropy is a bit like the complexity of entropy is a bit like the complexity of gravity, right? You can learn a bit about it and then apply it in the day to day, but there's kind of all these other levels of complexity. And so what I found easiest is to get to a point and say, okay, beyond this point, this is theoretical physics. I'll leave that to the physicists. But for us as information professionals, you're quite right. Entropy is part of the information environment. It is like gravity in the land environment. If you're going to fire a shot, if you're going to shoot a missile, gravity is going to be there to affect it and to change it, and it's something you have to account for. In the information environment, entropy um, makes things hard, whether it be the natural processes of the universe. So, for example, when you think back to the past, the further back into the past you go, the harder it is to see the detail. That's entropy kind of, in a sense, destroying that information, or at least making it harder to get value out of that information. And if you think further into the future, the further you go, the harder it is to predict, because again, you don't have that information. The entropy is higher. The further you try to push forward, because you're trying to make predictions and assumptions and assessments. And then that's kind of the natural, part of entropy in the universe. We have an entropic universe, but then actual actions in the information environment can raise entropy, and often do. And I mean, a common example is just telling a lie. If someone tells a lie or puts some disinformation in the environment, you're raising entropy in the environment, because you're making things more uncertain for other actors. Truth and objective reality is kind of harder to understand. So when you mention Taddeo's writings, she's an information expert, and she's really thought about the ethics of information, and not even necessarily in a warfare sense, but she herself, realized the centrality of entropy in the environment and how harmful it can be. And so she's applied an ethical framework over it to say, well, look, if you want to be an ethical information actor, you should be reducing, preventing, removing entropy out of the information environment, and you should be promoting, the flourishing of other information actors. And I think that's going to be an important layer in the warfare space. It'll still be broadly true. We have traditions of the just war theory, and proportionality, and ensuring that our military activities achieve their aims at the minimum amount of harm and negativity. Well, we can marry it with these concepts of minimizing entropy and thinking through what do you need to do to achieve that military objective whilst not raising or minimizing the amount of entropy you put into the environment. And that'll cause some interesting dilemmas. You could have a situation where you're the IO planner for joint maneuver, and the boss says we need to make sure no one knows about the tanks behind the hill, so we're going to deceive the enemy and tell them the tanks are somewhere else. Now you're going to use all your means to conduct that deception operation, and that might involve telling locals, oh, the tanks are going to roll through your town, when they're not. And all the people in that town, worry, they evacuate, they get out of there. You've caused harm to them, you've raised the uncertainty. And then for the people, perhaps in the other area where the tanks really will be, how do they prepare? Because you're not going to tell them, otherwise your deception operation is going to fail. So there's going to be all these times where you may have to put entropy in the environment for operational effect, but an ethical military will do that, in the minimum way possible.
Right. Well, the fog of war, once you understand the concept of entropy, or start wading into the implications, it's a really useful concept. I am a retired United States Marine, and so the Marine Corps is part of the naval service for the U.S. Department of Defense, and so I grew up in the Marine Corps hearing about Navy commanders, quote unquote, fighting the ship. And I think that there are a couple of different ways of interpreting that. You literally fight the ship with, tactical or operational fighting potentially. But I think people also used it as a term for management. And managing the organization, and you're fighting the entropic tendency of organizations left unmanaged will just kind of disintegrate, or it's the lunatics running the asylum, or what's that famous book, oh shucks, Lord of the Flies, where the children are governing themselves on this island, and they just they're little savages, but all of that is different representations of entropy. But the point that I guess that I started making, and then I got a little derailed there. The first time Lord of the Flies has been mentioned on the Cognitive Crucible, a Cognitive Crucible first, but it takes energy to get injected into processes or into ecosystems in order to manage them, or in order to lower the entropy. So the way you create order is by properly or appropriately putting energy into an ecosystem. Like if a room is messy, right, you have to put your mental energy and time and effort into cleaning up that room, and then the entropy in the room is lower because you've put energy into it. And if you don't tend to it over time, it'll go back to the way it was. But anyway, all of this I think has operational and information warfare implications.
Well, what I take from that is, entropy has always been a consideration in warfare. It just might not have been called out and to the full level, and the importance might not have always been there. But we mentioned Clauzewicz before, and he talks about chance and uncertainty. which is certainly, you know, entropic type concepts. But he also talks about things like friction and says how, you know, I'm going to misquote this, but he talks about how, you know, actions are easy, but everything in war is really, really hard. And I think that's what you're saying there with that fighting the ship. But the other thing I wanted to raise was the concept of causality. Because I mean, entropy describes, you know, the hazards or risks that are in the information environment. But the other thing information professionals need to understand is causality, and how information enhances our ability to navigate causality. So causality is pretty straightforward. We live in a causal universe. You know, actions lead to effects. One event leads to another event. And we as humans want to navigate that. You know, we want to prosper and we want to live happy lives and sort of have things go our way. Information's super important, firstly, because if you have a lot of information, you have a better understanding of likely causality, and you can make predictions about the future. And you know, we've known that for a long time. So we had things like intelligence services to get secret information and gain that advantage. But I think in the 21st century, what we've really realized is information technology can actually influence causality. You can actually use it to generate those outcomes that you want. And, you know, we see this in electronic warfare, electronic attack. Use an information system through the electromagnetic spectrum, knock out the adversary's comms, they lose the ability to talk to each other, and their land maneuver or their physical maneuver falls apart. The ability to influence audiences across the globe through the internet. Our rise of information systems and how we generate and use information is actually providing us with more options to influence and gain that causal outcome that we actually want.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Maybe we can turn the page just a little bit and get some of your thoughts around information power and how that relates to information warfare. I'm sure everything we've been talking about relates in some way.
Yeah, it's something I'm looking into more and more, and I don't think I consider myself an information power expert yet, but I'll do what I can. I mean, I think for liberal democratic societies like Australia and the US, not just focusing on the warfare aspects of information, if we actually start to focus on the broader power that we can bring to bear, I think that's going to be where a lot of our national advantages will rest. We often look at authoritarian countries and we see them as being able to, you know, command information and ensure everything aligns under, you know, a single structure, and everyone does what they're told, and they can censor the internet and all this kind of thing. And we think, oh, you know, they're ahead of us and they've got more strength. If we take a very broad view of information power and really think through all the elements that can contribute to it, we can realize that Western nations have a lot of strengths here. And so I mean things like our national education systems, our science and research systems, our transparency and openness, the customs and traditions. I mean, you look at US music and movie culture and how much that spreads across the globe. These are all means of spreading information or informational power into the globe, and they're often persuasive means, not coercive means. So for places like Australia, if we can think deeper about information power and all the instruments that we have, I think we'll be able to navigate that geostrategic environment much better. So, and this includes things like our national intelligence agencies, whether they like it or not. I see them as instruments of national information power. Now that there's sort of an asterisk there, because I know you've got things like covert action authorities and stuff, which sort of fit in potentially in a slightly different bucket. But at the end of the day, much of what intelligence agencies do is gain secret information and gain that informational advantage over adversaries. So where Australia needs to drive to, I think, is to have a mature mechanism at the whole of government level to set and manage, well, firstly a grand strategy, but then emerging from that grand strategy should be like an information strategy that allows us to combine all elements of national power to protect and advance our interests, and in particular that information power. But it's going to need to be supported by communities of interest, whether it's government departments, private sector, community groups, and ensure that there's a way to have deep thinking about what does it need to look like, how do we interact, who's bringing it all together, what are the standards and ethics that we meet, and how do we actually gain that sophisticated information advantage using our strengths.
there's a lot packed into that. So I'm not going to do it justice to comment on everything, but as you're talking there, one of the something that has dawned on me. I think I've brought this up before in the podcast, and so if I'm
Mhm.
repeating myself, I'm sorry to people who are like, you've talked about this before, but I feel strongly that uh, we uh, the West, well, I mean, really the entire world, but let's just stick with the West. Um, we have a tremendous amount of surplus creativity,
Yeah.
which needs to get harnessed and tapped into in a productive way. So, I mean, this is a little pessimistic, and it's an overgeneralization. But there are lots of people who are frivolously playing video games. I'm not saying that playing a video game is a bad thing, not at all. But I think people are playing too much video games probably. And then there's like a crisis of despair coming out of COVID. There are young people, arguably young people are really getting their lives changed in ways that we don't fully understand yet with social media. Anyway, all of this stuff kind of goes toward, some kind of a state where we need to somehow like pull ourselves out of it a little bit. But being able to harness this collective creativity, which is latent within our societies, I think goes a little bit to what you were talking about, as far as like one more instrument of
Yeah.
informational power that
Yeah.
needs to get figured out and tapped into and directed productively.
I think harnessed is the key word you had there, and I'd even perhaps shy away from words like directed in some circumstances.
Sure, yeah. I'm not talking about like a communist agenda.
But what I'm saying is, I mean, we've seen it with quite a lot of the Western and global response to Ukraine, whereby uh, communities across the globe were able to rally around a moral outrage, a moral position, and go, hang on, this is wrong, and X should be Y. Therefore, we're now going to do everything we can to contribute to that. And that doesn't mean every single person signs up and goes into Ukraine in a uniform. For a lot of people, it's having discussions in video games. It's I'm a gamer and I listen to some gaming YouTube channels. Now they don't get too deep into politics, but you can hear it coming through where they say, "Look, I don't agree with what's happening in there. Let's concentrate on the game that we play, but I don't agree with what's going on there." And I think there's this real power we have in liberal democracies to have a semi-decentralized system where the government isn't going to tell everyone exactly how to think or what to do, but can rally around a shared identity and a shared morals and ethics. But that doesn't mean that we don't have structures, frameworks that we need to build. We do need to build. I think those strategy areas and build those information capabilities, and in a lot of cases, they're going to be the ones that we focused outwards. Certainly not looking at a great firewall or anything like that China uses, for example.
What types of things are you envisioning are on the near-term horizon as far as the information environment is concerned?
So I'm not gonna. I'll never put a time frame on it because I think prediction is just a good way to be wrong. But I can certainly see some interesting things that are coming in the information environment. And I think to fully understand them, the first step is to understand the foundational meaning of cyber. I'm a bit of a cyber heretic in the sense that I think it's a word that's misused and misunderstood in many circumstances. So putting aside deep cyber capabilities and all the sort of practitioner level stuff that many talented people do, looking at cyber at its sort of societal level, um, to me, it's actually a word that's trying to encapsulate the nature of the information environment in, say, 2022. We're talking about a cyber information environment, an environment where the virtual world, primarily, your smartphone and your computer and your laptop, is becoming increasingly important and intermixed with the real world. Your connections to friends and family and where you go to get information. You Google search things. So cyber really is a comment about how things have changed in the information environment. So When we look ahead, I can see two things that are going to potentially have big changes. One is Web 3.0, and the other is the concept of metaverses. So very briefly, and apologies to those who know far more than me on these, but Web 3.0, in my mind, is kind of a proposed evolution of how the internet functions. One that really looks at blockchain technology and how do we actually decentralize ownership of data. The second one, metaverse, like cyber, I see as being like a catchy term for society, one that is trying to really capture, what's after cyber. What happens when, you and I increasingly integrate in virtual worlds? You and I decide to go shopping to buy virtual and real goods, in a virtual shopping mall. It sort of sounds a bit naff now because, I think we're not really sure what it's going to look like and how it's going to function. So there's going to be a lot of failures and a lot of things that we'll look back on and go, wow, I can't believe we thought that was the metaverse. But you can, I think, look far into the future and see a world where you could be walking down the street and have that AR overlay where you can see information about the weather and things that other people can't see. Unfortunately, probably be a world with spam and advertising and all the stuff we don't like about Web 2.0. But it'll just be a highly intermixed world of virtual and real information and how we navigate through that. And so my challenge to information professionals is to really think about what this could mean for their jobs and how we generate and apply information power, information warfare, security. It was a big deal in Australia when the Australian Signals Directorate, the NSA equivalent over here, revealed that it conducted what we called covert online operations. They revealed this into open source. And covert online operations involve developing virtual identities and penetrating networks or perhaps getting into a group of individuals through that virtual identity and manipulating them, or even just collecting information, but in sometimes manipulating what they think and what they do via things like social media. Now that's still a very, once you put away the computer, you're not necessarily interacting with that individual. Imagine a world where that's 24/7 all the time. You could be having that conversation with someone through the metaverse whilst walking around the real world. And so if we've learned anything from the cyber age, it's to recognize that things are going to change. Information environment's going to change, and how people and humanity interact with it will change. I really hope in a few years' time we don't start hearing about metaversal warfare, because to me it's information warfare, but it's just doing it in that metaversal concept, just like we are in that kind of cyber-centric concept that we have now.
For interested audience members, we'll put a link in the show notes. We just had a show with Dr. Rand Waltzman, one of the founding members of IPA, where we do a deep dive into the metaverse and some of the emerging concerns related to influence that are possible in these immersive VR environments, which are worth thinking about for sure. And they're coming at us. It's it's highly doubtful anybody's going to be able to stop it. And so there's these things are definitely coming down the track, and you've painted some interesting vignettes for us to think about there as well, Glenn. Maybe we can do a quick lightning round and and then wrap up. So I'll just toss out a couple of words and phrases to you, and you just like give it a quick hit, whatever comes to mind for you. So let's start off with talent.
Two things. I think it's not saying anything new to say that there's a war for talent there's not enough of the right people, particularly in places like the national security community and I guess in those information related areas. I think that's something that's going to endure, which then leads me kind of to my second point, which I think realizing that the talent isn't going to have to always be inside the tent. If we start to take a more whole of nation view, or at least a whole of government view, and start to array ourselves, understand that geometry about who does what and who contributes what, we can start to leverage talent that exists, adjacent to us, in different departments, and potentially in broader society.
All right, collaboration.
Ridiculously important. Again, showing my army background, it was all about combined arms. An infantry soldier is good. An infantry soldier with tanks is better. An infantry soldier with all the other capabilities and the land warfare system behind them is fantastic. And I think we've seen in Ukraine, when you invade a country and you don't take sufficient, you don't take control of the skies, you don't collaborate properly, you have a bad time. And so this is true in the information space. Cyber might be the big thing you need one day. It could be, PsyOps the next, or some kind of ISR collection. And so you need to have the systems and the thinking to collaborate across all means and capabilities.
All right. And last, kinetic versus competition.
Well, unfortunately, again, Ukraine stole my thunder a little bit. If we had done this before, 100 and something days ago, I would have said to people, don't forget the kinetic angle. I think it's possible to hear about a hot new thing and decide it's going to do everything and solve all problems. And information warfare won't solve all problems, neither will information power. And so when we look at Ukraine, I think we need to go forward realizing that you need all elements of state power, whether it's kinetic based or cooperative, coercive, competitive. And you need to have, a strategy that can adapt to what will still be a changing and uncertain geostrategic environment.
Let me throw one more at you, and this is piggybacking off of your metaverse and cyber discussion from just a moment ago. What do you think about the cognitive domain as its own warfighting domain?
Yeah, part of me is against it. I don't know if we necessarily need to keep splitting those domains, and then this goes back to our discussions about abstraction versus specificity, and there's upsides and downsides to both. My main thinking is that cognition is an information process. Any cognitive state is built upon a quantity of information. So for me, whether you use layer or subset or section, whatever term you want, to me, the cognitive element is a portion of the information environment. Right now, that portion is primarily in your head, in my head, in people's heads around the world. But as we move to artificial intelligence, we're going to see that cognition is not going to be exclusively humans. And that's going to have, we could go into a huge discussion about that, which I don't think we will today, but that will, I think, have big effects on the nature of warfare also.
All right. Well, let's wrap up. Glen, and could you give our audience a book recommendation?
Sure. I'll go a little bit different here because a lot of your previous people in this podcast have given really interesting books. I'm actually going to give an extremely dense and dry book. It's not easy to read, but I think it's worth having a flick through. Okay, so the book is the Routledge Handbook of the Philosophy of Information, and I'm sure we can add a link to it. It's something I picked up a few years ago as I was trying to answer this question of what is information. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a one-page answer. It's quite a thick book, but what it did for me, and I only understood maybe 50% of it, was realize how important information is. And I think that's something I'd love to give to your audience is recognize how important information is and how it comes across all aspects of the universe and humanity. And if we can think about information with the right definition, we'll be much better as information professionals.
All right, excellent suggestion. And with that, Glen Edwards, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.